Please, please help me. Hannah Mercer's voice broke in the biting wind of a winter night in Chicago, thin and trembling like a thread about to snap. She stood before the towering iron gate of a mansion set deep in a quiet suburb, where the warm spill of yellow light reached only far enough to show her hands locked tightly around a tiny little girl wrapped in a torn blanket. She has a fever. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. I just need a little something. A fever reducer, a bit of food, or take her to the hospital. Once she's stable, I'll leave right away. I promise. I won't cause trouble. Not much. When she finished, Hannah bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying, trying to hold on to the last shred of dignity a mother could have after life had shoved her to the very edge. No home, no job, no one to call. Only one door left to knock on. The steps before the gate were slick with melting snow, her thin shoes soaked through and cold enough to numb her feet. But she didn't dare loosen her grip. The little girl in her arms, Maisie, 5 years old, sagged like a leaf, her hot breath washing against her mother's collar, and then growing weaker. And just as Hannah thought she'd collapse before that gate could ever open, Maisie stirred faintly. Her lashes fluttered, revealing honey-colored eyes and the smallest little frown, an innocent, unconscious gesture. Yet so familiar, it made the man watching from inside the house freeze in place. It was Grant Hale, the boss whose name the whole city only dared to speak in whispers. 37 years old, formidable and possessed of an icy resolve that made people whisper he had forgotten the meaning of pain. And yet in a single breath, the wind outside, the heater's hum in the hallway, even the beat of his heart seemed to be crushed tight in an unseen fist. Because those eyes, that tiny frown, they were identical to a memory he had buried deep with a grave many years ago. A memory that should never have been able to climb out of cold earth and stand at his gate tonight. And the most frightening thing was this. Grant knew, with absolute clarity, that if he opened that gate, his life would never return to what it had been. If you want to know why a little girl he'd never met could make a mafia boss go utterly still, follow the story to the very end. Don't forget to like if you found this opening gripping. Share it so more people can listen, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The heavy iron gate, nearly 200 kilograms, slid slowly to one side, the metal's rasping squeal cutting through the snowy night like the groan of an aging beast. Grant Hale stepped through the threshold with the child in his arms, Maisie's small body curled inside his black cashmere coat, her hair mussed and slick with sweat, stuck to her burning forehead. She wasn't crying anymore, and it was that silence that made Grant move faster, because he'd learned long ago that children stopped crying not because the pain was gone, but because their bodies were so exhausted they no longer had the strength to call out. Behind him, Hannah Mercer dragged her feet along the stone path leading into the mansion, her thin fabric shoes soaked through with snow, each step leaving a smear of dirty water on the gray stone. She didn't dare walk beside Grant, and she didn't dare slow down, afraid the gate would close and swallow her on the other side, separating her from Maisie. She just needs to rest for a little while, Hannah said, her voice shaking from the cold and from something deeper than cold, something that felt like the fear of owing a debt to a man she didn't even know. When she's better, we'll leave right away. I promise. We won't be a bother. Grant didn't look back, didn't answer, his footsteps steady and final on the steps leading to the front door. He didn't need to answer, because in his world a stranger's promises carried no weight, and he'd heard the pleas of the desperate too many times to be moved by them. The oak door opened, warmth pouring out like an invisible wall, and Hannah nearly buckled on the threshold because her body had forgotten what warmth even felt like. Caleb Rourke stood in the foyer with his arms crossed, his gaze sweeping from Grant to the child, and then settling on Hannah with undisguised wariness. "Who?" Caleb asked. A single word, but one that held an entire system of questions he meant to demand. Who she was, where she'd come from, who had sent her, whether she was bait, whether she carried a weapon, whether she was being watched. Grant laid Maisie down on the long sofa in the sitting room, careful as if he were setting down something made of glass, then pulled a cashmere throw from the back of a chair and covered her. "Call Dr. Park," Grant told Caleb without looking at him. "Tell him to bring a fever reduction kit and monitoring equipment. Don't ask why." Caleb didn't move. "Grant." His voice dropped, the voice he used only when they were alone, and Caleb needed Grant to hear him clearly. "You just brought a stranger into the house. At night. No check. No warning. Do you realize how many rules you just broke? Rules you wrote yourself? Grant straightened, turned to face Caleb, and in the sitting room's yellow light, his eyes held the sharp, unyielding glint of a winter's blade. I know, he said slowly. And I also know it's -7 degrees out there. The child's running nearly 40 degrees. And if I leave them at the gate for another 15 minutes, tomorrow morning the news will be carrying a story about a child frozen to death 30 meters from my house. Call Dr. Park. Right now. Caleb ground his teeth but pulled out his phone, turned, and walked into the hallway. Hannah stood in the corner of the room, with her back against the wall, as if she were trying to make herself smaller, to vanish into the white paint. She watched Maisie lying on a sofa that probably cost more than the shelter room the two of them had slept in, and her chest tightened until she could barely breathe, not from illness, but from the realization that her daughter was being cared for better by a stranger than she'd been able to manage for the past 3 months. Dr. Park arrived in less than 20 minutes, a small Asian man with a brown leather case and eyes that asked nothing beyond medicine. He pressed the thermometer to Maisie's forehead, listened to her lungs, checked her pulse, and then his expression shifted. Not much, only a slight frown, but Grant read it instantly, because he was used to reading the smallest changes on other people's faces. That was how he survived in this world. 39.8, Dr. Park said, his voice low and even. But it's not an ordinary fever. Her breathing is faster than normal, there are signs of severe dehydration, and I'm hearing a faint wheeze in the left lung. She needs fluids and monitoring, but if her temperature goes above 40 within the next hour, there's a risk of fever-induced seizures. I don't have enough equipment here to handle that situation. The sitting room went quiet. Hannah covered her mouth with both hands, tears running through her fingers. She didn't dare sob out loud, afraid of being a nuisance, afraid of being thrown out, afraid of everything. Grant looked at Maisie, at the way she breathed too fast, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath the blanket, and something inside him shifted, not softening, but waking, like a beast that had hibernated too long, roused by a familiar scent it thought it had forgotten. Caleb, Grant called, and the chill in his voice had evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. It was sharp, like a blade just honed. Get the black SUV ready, the backup plates. Call ahead to the Northwestern Hospital Emergency Department. Use the name Arthur Bryce. Tell them to prepare a private room. No public record. No hallway cameras. Direct cash payment. We leave in 10 minutes. Caleb stopped at the doorway, looked at Grant again, then looked at Hannah folded over in the corner, crying without sound, and for the first time that night, his expression wasn't pure suspicion anymore. It carried something like confusion, because he'd never seen Grant Hale act for a stranger. Never. Not once in the 6 years he'd stood beside this man. Grant walked over to Hannah. He didn't touch her, only stood close enough for her to hear him without his having to raise his voice. Get up, he said, not gentle, but not cruel, only a pure command. She needs the hospital. You can cry here, or you can go with your child. Choose one. Hannah looked up, eyes raw, lips cracked, and she met Grant Hale's gaze for the first time since she'd stepped through that iron gate. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say sorry. She said only 2 words, her voice hoarse but steady as stone. I'm coming. Grant nodded, turned away, and headed for the door. Outside, the snow was still falling, and the black SUV was already running, its headlights sweeping through the darkness like the eyes of a beast cutting a path through the woods. In the back seat, Maisie lay across Hannah's lap, her tiny hand gripping the tie of her mother's coat, a reflex she had whenever she was afraid. Grant sat opposite them, silent, but his gaze never left the child. It didn't leave the way she clutched that tie. It didn't leave the way that small chest rose and fell too fast, too shallow, and a crack, as fine as a strand of hair, began to spread across the wall he'd built for years, the wall he'd believed nothing could ever pierce. The black SUV tore through Chicago's snow-covered streets at a pace just fast enough not to draw the attention of any patrol car, and just slow enough that Hannah could keep Maisie steady on her lap without being jolted out of place every time the vehicle turned. Caleb drove, both hands clenched around the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched, his eyes sweeping the rearview mirror again and again, a habit carved into him from years in a world where a car on your tail could mean death. Grant sat still across from Hannah, phone to his ear, his voice low and clipped as he spoke to someone on the other end. Nothing but orders with not a word wasted. A private room on the 3rd floor, No registration in the central system. The attending physician to be his person. Payment the moment it was done. When they stopped at the service gate of Northwestern Hospital, a nurse was already waiting with a small gurney, and everything happened so fast, Hannah almost couldn't understand what was unfolding. Maisie was placed on the gurney, taken to a private elevator, straight up to the 3rd floor, into a stark white room, with a window overlooking an empty parking lot, blanketed in snow. The attending doctor was a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair. She didn't ask for a real name. She didn't ask about relationship. She asked only for symptoms, allergy, history, and when the child had last eaten and drunk properly. Hannah opened her mouth and no sound came, because the honest answer to that question was something too shameful to speak in this brightly lit room, among people in clean white coats. Grant looked at her, then looked at the doctor, and answered for her in an even tone, as if reading a report. Estimated severe dehydration. Possibly inadequate intake for 3 to 5 days. Fever rising steadily for at least 24 hours. History unclear because there are no accompanying medical records. The statement wasn't cruel, but it exposed the truth Hannah had been trying to hide, and she felt as if she'd been stripped bare in the emergency room, not in body, but in the full scope of her failure as a mother. The doctor started an IV, placed cooling pads on Maisie's forehead and on both sides of her neck, clipped monitors for heart rate and oxygen saturation onto the child's tiny finger, then spoke in a calm but serious voice. The temperature was 39.9. If it reached 40.2, they would need intravenous fever medication, because the risk of fever-induced seizures in a small child with a body this depleted was very high. The lungs showed signs of mild inflammation but didn't yet require oxygen. Breathing needed to be checked every 15 minutes, and if there were any sign of seizure activity, even a slight tremor in a finger, they were to call her immediately. Hannah sat beside Maisie's bed, both hands holding her daughter's hand, and she began to speak without anyone asking, as if the words had been packed in her throat for too long, and tonight they spilled out on their own because she no longer had the strength to keep them in. She said they'd been living in a shelter for 7 days, and before that 3 nights on overnight buses because buses had heat and didn't drive out people who slept as long as they kept paying the fare, and before that a rented room in the suburbs where the landlord locked the door in the middle of the night and threw her things onto the back porch after she fell short on rent for the 2nd month. She told it out of order, without coherence, her voice breaking and threading into the steady beep of the heart monitor, but Grant caught every word, not out of compassion, but because each detail was a piece of a larger picture, and he needed to know who he was facing, what he was bringing into his house, what he was getting entangled in. While Hannah spoke and Grant listened, Caleb quietly did what he always did whenever a stranger entered the safe radius of Grant Hale. He took Hannah's battered backpack from the back seat, carried it into the hallway, and searched every compartment with methodical care. Inside there was no weapon, no suspicious phone, no tracking device, only 2 sets of children's clothes rolled into tight bundles, a zip bag holding old papers, including an expired driver's license and a laminated social security card, a ballpoint pen nearly out of ink, and at the bottom of the bag, crushed, as if it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times, a brown envelope printed with the words, "Adoption Finalization," and the logo of an agency Caleb didn't recognize. He photographed the envelope, photographed the documents inside, then put everything back exactly where it had been, and carried the backpack into the room, returning it to its place without saying a word. Hannah didn't know her bag had been searched. She was slumped beside Maisie's bed, eyes closed but not asleep, her hand still holding her child's. Maisie's temperature began to fall after the first dose, 39.5, then 39.2, and the nurse recorded it every 15 minutes, exactly as the doctor required. Grant stood by the window with his back to the bed, looking out at the snow below but not truly seeing anything, until the nurse changed the sheets and pushed up Maisie's sleeve to adjust the IV line, and the oversized hospital gown slipped down, exposing the child's left shoulder and neck. Grant turned at that precise moment, and he saw it. A light brown birthmark, misshapen like a torn leaf, sat just beneath the left collarbone, stretching about 2 finger joints in length, and beside it was a small, thin, silvery white scar like the cut of a shard of glass. Grant went utterly still, not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of a man who has just been shot through the chest and hasn't yet fallen, the stillness of someone staring at the ghost of the person he buried, because he'd seen that birthmark before, not once, but hundreds of times, In nights when he'd held a baby much smaller than Maisie in his arms and sung lullabies in a voice no one in his organization believed he possessed. The torn leaf birthmark, the hair-thin scar beside it. He'd last seen them in a photograph taken at the morgue 5 years ago, when they told him to identify the body of his child. Grant gripped the window frame, his fingers tightening until the painted white wood creaked, and his world, the world he had built out of power, money, and unshakable detachment, so he would never have to feel pain again, suddenly shook at its foundation, all because of a torn leaf-shaped birthmark on the shoulder of a 5-year-old child, receiving IV fluids in a snowy night. Grant left the hospital room without saying a single word. His stride was fast but not rushed, the kind of walk a man used when he was forcing an internal shock into silence with every ounce of discipline he'd spent more than a decade forging in the underworld. Caleb noticed the shift right away. Not because Grant's face showed anything unusual, but because there was something in his eyes Caleb had never seen in 6 years at this man's side, something that looked like panic, only frozen solid before it could break the surface. "Stay here," Grant said as he passed Caleb, his voice just a little rougher than usual. But that little difference was enough for Caleb to know something had happened tonight, something bigger than a feverish child and a homeless mother. "Watch those two. Nobody in, nobody out." Caleb nodded and didn't ask anything else, because he knew when to ask, and when silence was the safest answer. Grant drove back to the estate alone, the snow-covered road empty at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, and through that 15-minute drive, he didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone, nothing but the wipers sweeping snow off the windshield, and the hard thud of his heartbeat so strong he could feel it at his temples. When he got home, he went straight to the second floor, turned into the west hallway, to a room that even Caleb didn't have a key for. It was small, windowless, soundproofed, and inside there was only a wooden table, a chair, and a large safe bolted into the wall. The kind with a 12-digit code and an added fingerprint lock. Grant pressed his thumb to the glass sensor, entered the sequence he could never forget, because it was the birthday of the child he had buried, and the safe opened with a small, dry click. Inside wasn't cash. It wasn't weapons. It wasn't business contracts. Inside was the past. A thick stack of files almost 4 inches high, in a clear plastic cover, labeled in black ink. Incident report, date, month, year, 5 years ago. The accident file. Grant pulled it out, set it on the table, and for the first time in years, he opened it page by page, his eyes flickering over the name of his late wife, Sarah Hale, listed on the primary casualty report, police report, scene photographs, Sarah's death certificate, and clipped at the back, a request for a DNA test he had signed that day for the infant they claimed was his. He remembered his hand shaking as he signed, remembered the bite of disinfectant in the morgue, remembered the feeling that he wanted to blow everything around him apart and couldn't, because his body had gone completely numb. But tonight, reading it again, Grant saw things he hadn't been clear-headed enough to notice back then. On the DNA request form, in the lower right corner, there was a small handwritten note in blue ink, temporary ID, pending confirmation. And beneath that line, there was a faint red stamp that read, "Test canceled by authorization." Canceled by authorization. Grant read those 4 words again and again, and every time he read them, they cut deeper into what he understood. He had never authorized anyone to cancel a DNA test. He had never received the results. They told him it wasn't necessary because a visual ID was enough, because the birthmark matched, because even with injuries, the face was still recognizable. And he, blinded by the pain of a father who had just lost his child, believed them. Now, sitting in a windowless room at 3 o'clock in the morning, Grant Hale asked for the first time the question he had buried alive for 5 years. If the test was canceled, if the ID was only temporary, then who decided the baby in that morgue was his child? And more than that, why? He flipped a few more pages and found the name of the doctor who signed the confirmation. Elliot Vance, Emergency Department, County Hospital. The name wasn't unfamiliar, but Grant couldn't immediately place it within the vast web of people he'd crossed paths with. He photographed everything on his phone, locked the safe, and drove back to the hospital with a face that showed nothing, while inside him, a storm kept tightening into a harder and harder spiral. When Grant stepped into the 3rd-floor hallway, he heard Hannah's voice drifting out of the room, not speaking to anyone but speaking to herself, soft and broken in places, the voice of someone praying or trying to steady her own mind. Then he stopped. because he heard something else. Not from Hannah, but from Maisie. The little girl was drifting in and out through the fever, eyes closed, head rocking faintly on the pillow, and from the cracked, dry lips of a 5-year-old came one word, just one, but it punched through every wall Grant had built, through every layer of armor he'd worn, through 5 years of mourning and cold power, and pinned itself straight into the center of his chest. Mochi, Maisie whispered in her fever, her small hand clutching the air as if searching for the old, tattered bear she had left in Hannah's bag. Mochi, here. Grant froze outside the door. He knew that name. That wasn't the name of a stuffed animal. It wasn't the name of a cartoon character. It was the name his mother, Eleanor Hale, had stitched into the label of a small teddy bear she bought for her only grandchild before she died, a secret name known only to the family. A nickname Grant had buried with a small coffin at Oak Hill Cemetery on the coldest day of that year. Hannah looked toward the door and saw Grant standing there, his face drained pale under the fluorescent lights, and the instincts of a mother who had lived in fear for too long shoved her into defense. She sprang up, stepped back, yanked the blanket higher to cover Maisie, her eyes locked on Grant as if he were a hunting animal that had just changed, and her voice shook but held hard. What do you want? Why are you looking at my child like that? I won't let anyone take my child. I don't care who you are, how much money you have, or how many people you've got. I'd rather die right here than let anyone touch my child. Her voice broke at the end, but her body stayed upright, both arms spread in front of Maisie's bed, the stance of someone who had nothing in the world except her own body to use as a shield. Grant looked at her, looked at the child behind her, and he said nothing. Not because he dismissed her words, but because in his head, everything was collapsing and rebuilding at the same time, and he didn't yet know when the picture would be complete, only that the word Mochi had just changed everything. The next morning, when weak winter sunlight slipped through the hospital room window and Maisie's temperature had dropped to 37.8, Grant asked the attending physician to sign an early discharge and brought the two of them back to the mansion in the same black SUV as the night before. Hannah didn't want to go. She said the fever was down and she could manage from here, but Grant didn't argue. He said only one sentence. Where do you want to take her? Back to the shelter or to a bus seat? The question cut through every refusal Hannah had left, because it was truth. Truth so bare it felt cruel, and she had no way to deny it. When they reached the mansion, Grant led Hannah and Maisie to the East Guest Wing, a suite of rooms separated from the main house by a long corridor with a keypad locked door. Inside were a bedroom, a bathroom, a small kitchen, fully stocked supplies, clean to the point Hannah felt as if she were stepping into a hotel instead of someone's home. Grant stopped in the doorway. He didn't step inside. He kept his distance as a quiet way of telling Hannah this space was hers, that he wouldn't cross it. Then he laid out a bargain, his voice the same one he used when negotiating in boardrooms with smugglers at midnight. She and her child would stay in this guest wing. There would be security on duty. There would be food. There would be hot water. A doctor would be available if Maisie needed more checks. But in return, Hannah couldn't leave the mansion grounds without permission, couldn't contact anyone outside without permission, and couldn't ask why. Hannah listened, and what flared in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It was anger, the slow-burning anger of someone who'd had too much taken from her, and now realized that even kindness could be another kind of chain. So I'm being kept here, she said, her voice low but no longer shaking, because the fear of last night in the hospital had burned away the last of her timidity and left something harder, sharper, in its place. You give me a nice room, good food, then you say I can't leave. I can't call anyone. I can't ask questions. You call that help. I call it a prison with a soft mattress. Grant looked at her, and something flickered across his eyes. Not anger, almost surprise. Because in his world not many people dared speak to his face like that, not even the underworld bosses who sat across from him in million-dollar negotiations. You're free to leave any time, he replied, his voice even and slow. The door isn't locked from the outside. No one is holding you. But if you leave, what do you leave with? A torn backpack, 2 sets of children's clothes, and a child discharged less than 3 hours ago. How far do you get before she spikes a fever again? I'm not imprisoning you. I'm giving you a choice, and you hate me because that choice is better than anything you have. That isn't my fault. Hannah clenched her jaw. Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry, because she'd decided she wouldn't cry in front of this man one more time. I'm not a beggar, she said. each word as clear as a nail being driven into wood. I came here because my daughter was dying, not because I wanted someone to save me. I'll stay because Maisie needs to recover. But I want you to understand one thing. She's my child. Legal paperwork. I've raised her since she was brand new, and no one in this world has the right to take her from me. The last line came out almost a shout, her voice breaking at the end. But her eyes held steady without blinking, and the child on the bed behind her stirred faintly in sleep. Grant was silent for a long moment, long enough for Hannah to think he was about to say something cruel. But when he spoke, his voice wasn't as cold as before. It was deeper, heavier, as if each word were being pulled up from somewhere very deep inside him that he didn't want to touch. I'm not taking her from you, he said, if you aren't lying. Then he turned and left. No explanation. No pause for her response. The door closing softly behind him, and Hannah stood alone in the finest room she'd ever been in, her chest constricting around that sentence, because it wasn't a simple threat. It was a conditional threat, and the condition implied that Grant Hale knew something, or suspected something, about Maisie, about the paperwork, about Hannah's story, that she didn't yet understand. She pulled sleeping Maisie close, kissed her forehead, and for the first time she wondered whether that crumpled adoption envelope at the bottom of her backpack was truly the whole truth. That night, when the mansion sank into silence and the snow began to fall thicker again, the security camera at the gate recorded a vehicle with no plate stopping for about 30 seconds. An arm reached out of the window, set something on the ground. Then the car surged away into the darkness. Caleb checked at dawn and brought Grant a clear plastic bag coated in snow. Inside were two things. The first was a small teddy bear, its fur faded by time, one eye missing, its belly patched with clumsy hand stitches in red thread, and around its neck was a washed-out blue ribbon that Grant recognized instantly because he had tied that ribbon around the bear's neck himself on his child's first birthday. The bear he'd believed had burned in the accident along with everything he loved. The second was a black-and-white photograph, postcard-sized, showing the crash scene from 5 years ago. The car crushed, glass exploded across the frame, and in the corner someone had circled a small detail in red pen, something easy to miss at a glance. The child safety seat in the back, the harness unbuckled, not snapped open by impact, but unbuckled, by a human hand, before or after the crash happened. Grant held the teddy bear in his hand, his thumb unconsciously rubbing the red thread stitches, and he understood that someone was sending him a message, not a threat, but worse than a threat. A reminder that somewhere out there was someone who knew everything, had always known everything, and was watching his every step with the patience of a snake waiting for its prey to walk into its den. Grant sat in his study for nearly an hour after Caleb brought the plastic bag in. The teddy bear lay on the desk in front of him, its faded blue ribbon still tied around its neck like a small circle tightening around the past, and beside it sat the black and white photo, the detail of the unbuckled seatbelt circled in red like an eye staring straight at him. He knew this bear. He knew every stitch, every patch of worn fur, even the way it had felt heavy in his hands when he'd stuffed fresh filling into its belly after his child tore the seam the first time he tried to crawl, and he'd sewn it back up himself with red thread because it was the only spool he could find in the house at midnight. The bear should have burned. It should have been in the ash heap of that vehicle, with the car seat, with the blanket, with every fragment of a small life he'd lost. But it was here, on his desk, still carrying last night's snow, and that could mean only one thing. Someone had taken it out of the car either before or after the crash. Someone had kept it for 5 years, and someone had just left it at his gate as a way of saying, I'm still here, I still have my hands on what belongs to you, and you can't do a damn thing about it. Grant closed his eyes and drew in a long breath, and when he opened them, what lived in his gaze wasn't grief anymore. It was something far more dangerous, something Caleb recognized the moment he stepped into the room and saw Grant's face, the cold calculation of a wolf that had just caught the scent of its enemy. Go through every camera around the property, Grant said. His voice had returned to its calculated, surgical precision. The tone Caleb knew was the most dangerous one, because it meant Grant was past the shaking stage and had entered action. Not just ours. Traffic cameras within a 3-kilometer radius. Get our people at the police department to pull the footage. I want to know where that car came from, where it went, and who was inside. Caleb nodded and disappeared. Then 2 hours later, he returned with preliminary results. The car with no plates had sat about 200 meters from the estate for almost 40 minutes before rolling up to the gate to drop off the plastic bag, and earlier, traffic footage showed it coming from the direction of the Southern Commercial District, where there were at least 3 public parking lots with no cameras. Professional, planned, not impulsive. "There's one more thing," Caleb said, his voice more cautious than usual. "I went back through footage from 2 days ago. There was a similar car, same make and shape, parked in almost the exact same spot for about 30 minutes. Then it left. That means they'd been watching the house at least before Hannah showed up." That sentence changed everything. If someone had been surveilling the estate before Hannah arrived, then either Hannah was part of the plan, or she was just an accidental piece pushed onto the right board, and Grant needed to know which answer was true before the other side made its next move. He stood, slid the teddy bear into a locked drawer, placed the photo into a sealed envelope, and made a decision Caleb hadn't expected. He would take Maisie to the county hospital for an official, comprehensive checkup, with a full medical record, with her real name, with every test that needed to be done. "The county hospital?" Caleb repeated, his brow tightening, because that meant Grant would have to step outside the protective shell of the false identity he always used when he dealt with public systems. "You sure? Northwestern already has an initial file under the name Bryce. Why not stay there?" "Because I don't need a fake file," Grant said. "I need a real one. I need blood work, blood type, allergies, medical history, everything a public hospital does for a child who's had no prior records. And I need it inside the federal system, not sitting in the private file of a cash-paid hospital." Caleb understood, not instantly, but fast enough. Grant didn't just want Maisie examined. He wanted to create an official paper trail, proof of existence that couldn't be erased, couldn't be edited, couldn't be bought off. So if someone was playing games with wiping tracks, that game would fail because the child would now be in the system with complete biological data. When Grant went down to the guest area to tell Hannah, she was feeding Maisie thin porridge in the small kitchen. The child was more alert now, eyes brighter, cheeks still lightly flushed but without the limp, drained look from the night before. Hannah listened as Grant explained the hospital trip, and her first reaction was to pull Maisie closer, her hand locking onto her daughter's shoulder like a clasp, her eyes on Grant with a vigilance that had become her default whenever he appeared. "A public hospital will ask for paperwork," she said, her voice hard. "They'll ask who I am, who she is, why there's no record before this. What do you want out of this?" Grant looked at her, then at Maisie, then back at Hannah, and he said, "I want the truth. You should want that too." Hannah didn't understand everything he meant, but she understood enough to know that if she didn't go with them, Grant would still take Maisie, and she'd rather be there to keep her child in sight than sit in this beautiful room and wait for the worst. She wiped Maisie's mouth, helped her into her coat, then followed Grant to the door with her back straight and her jaw clenched, walking like someone stepping into a place she knew could strip away the most precious thing in her life, but still stepping forward, because staying behind was even more terrifying. Cook County Hospital sat on the south side of Chicago, an old building with a dull brown brick face and long, hollow corridors that smelled of antiseptic, mixed with cheap vending machine coffee, a place the upper class never set foot in. And for that very reason, the records here lived under a federal system. Impossible to buy, impossible to hide, impossible to erase with a midnight phone call. Grant walked into the emergency department, with Maisie in his arms, Caleb and Hannah tight at his sides, Hannah's hand clenched around the tie of her child's coat, as if someone might snatch the little girl out of reach at any second. The morning ER wasn't too crowded, a few people waiting with minor injuries, an elderly woman hacking in the corner, and the triage nurse looked at the group that had just come in with open curiosity, because the contrast was too stark to ignore. Grant's expensive suit, Hannah's worn old coat with frayed shoulders, and the pale child between them forming a picture she couldn't fit into any familiar pattern. They were taken into an exam room within 20 minutes, faster than usual, not because Grant used money or power, but because Maisie still showed clear signs of fatigue, and the attending physician wanted to check her right away. The doctor on duty was a young man with short hair and metal-rimmed glasses, his hand moving quickly as he took notes while Hannah answered basic questions about Maisie's health history. When he asked Maisie to take off her coat for a general exam, she lifted her arms obediently, and the oversized hospital gown from the previous admission, which Hannah hadn't had time to change, slipped off her shoulder and revealed the skin beneath the left collarbone. The doctor had been placing his stethoscope on Maisie's chest when he stopped, his eyes locking on the torn leaf-shaped birthmark and the thin, silvery scar beside it. Then he pulled the exam light closer, tilted his head, and his face changed in a way Grant recognized instantly. Not ordinary medical concern, but recognition of something, suspicion, an association with a case he'd heard about or read in a chart. The doctor looked up. His gaze brushed Grant's for a beat, then shifted to Hannah, and he asked in a normal voice, even as his grip tightened around his pen, "How long have this birthmark and scar been there? Since birth or from an injury?" Hannah answered that she'd adopted Maisie when the child was very small, and the birthmark had already been there, and she didn't know the exact origin of the scar. The doctor nodded, wrote a few more lines, then said he needed to consult a colleague with more experience in complex pediatric cases, and asked to step out for a moment. Grant didn't stop him, but his eyes followed the doctor down the hallway as he turned into the staff room, and through the glass panel in the door, Grant saw him speaking with another man, taller, hair slightly salt and pepper, wearing a white coat with a name embroidered on the chest. And when that man turned, Grant read the letters on the fabric. Dr. Elliot Vance. The name in the accident file. The name he'd read at 3 a.m. in a windowless room at the mansion. Elliot Vance entered the exam room with the calm, professional composure of a doctor who'd spent decades in the job. But that composure shattered in less than 3 seconds. He looked at Maisie first, at the torn leaf birthmark, at the thin scar, then at the child's face, at the eyes, at the line of the jaw, and the blood drained from his face so quickly that even Hannah noticed. Elliot Vance went pale in the literal sense, his skin shifting from pink to gray-white in an instant, the hand holding the chart trembling, and he took half a step back, as if he'd just seen a ghost. Then his eyes moved to Grant, and this time the fear in Elliot's gaze couldn't be hidden at all. It was bare, complete, the kind of fear of a man realizing the past he thought he'd buried, had climbed out of the ground, and was standing right in front of him in the body of a 5-year-old child. "Out," Grant said to the young doctor in a voice that didn't allow argument, and the younger man looked to Elliot as if waiting for instruction. But Elliot only gave a weak nod, and the doctor left, closing the door behind him. Hannah pulled Maisie into her arms, her eyes flicking back and forth between Grant and Elliot, not understanding what was happening, yet every cell in her body screaming that something huge, something dangerous had just walked into this room. Grant stepped forward, facing Elliot, close enough that the doctor had to tip his head back to look up at him. And Grant's voice was low, slow, each word dropping like stone. "You recognize her?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Elliot swallowed, his throat bobbing, his eyes darting to the door as if searching for a way out. But Caleb was right there in the hallway, and Elliot knew he wasn't going anywhere until Grant allowed it. "I need access to the records archive," Grant continued, his voice not louder, yet the pressure in each word thickening like a wall pushing inward. "The file from 5 years ago. The crash case. You know exactly which case I mean." Elliot opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and he looked like a man trapped between two terrors, afraid of the man in front of him, and afraid of someone else whose name he didn't dare say, and the second fear was clearly bigger because he shook his head, his voice trembling. "I can't. You don't understand. If I open the archive, if anyone finds out, I'll—" He didn't finish, but the implication was plain. He'd die. Grant watched him, and something shifted in his eyes. Not pity, but a cold understanding that Elliot Vance was a pawn on someone's board, held in place by fear, kept in line by guilt, and pawns didn't move unless they were forced. Grant leaned in, closer, and spoke very softly, only loud enough for Elliot to hear. "You're more afraid of him than you're afraid of me. That's your mistake." Elliot closed his eyes, drew one long, shaky breath, and when he opened them again, something inside him broke, something that had kept him silent for 5 years, and he looked straight into Grant Hale's eyes, his voice a whisper, yet each word as clear as a blade carving into stone. "You didn't bury the wrong person. You were deceived." The small exam room sank into silence after Elliot's words, a silence so thick Hannah could hear the fluorescent light on the ceiling buzzing and Maisie's steady breathing on her lap, the child already asleep from exhaustion after a long morning, unaware that a few sentences spoken in this room could change her whole life. Grant stood motionless, staring at Elliot as if he could see straight through him, and when he spoke, his voice was so flat it was frightening. "Keep talking." Elliot Vance leaned back against the wall, his arms hanging at his sides, and he no longer looked like a doctor, so much as a prisoner who'd finally decided to confess after years of locking himself inside a lie. He began to speak, low and broken, eyes fixed on the floor as if he couldn't bear to face anyone in the room. The night of the crash 5 years earlier, when the car was crushed at the intersection on the west side of the city, the ambulance brought in not one child but two, both under 1 year old, both injured, both from the same vehicle, because Grant's personal driver had been dropping off his own wife and infant daughter on the way, a detail kept private within the household. The emergency department that night was chaos, Elliot said. He was the only on-call physician with pediatric experience. They were short-staffed on nurses, short on equipment. There was blood everywhere, and the two babies came in at the same time on 2 different gurneys. But the intake paperwork got tangled because nobody managed to put identification bands on them in those first critical minutes. One baby died on the resuscitation table after 40 minutes of CPR. The other lived but was injured, with a small cut from glass on the left shoulder, right beside a leaf-shaped birthmark. Elliot paused there, swallowed hard, and went on. When he was filling out the death certificate and identification forms, a man showed up. Not a doctor, not a police officer, not family, but the kind of person Elliot described as someone who wore a suit, spoke softly, and made things happen without anyone daring to ask why. The man handed Elliot an envelope of cash, thick as 3 months of salary, and a paper to sign. Confirm the identity of the dead baby as Grant Hale's child, and cancel the request for a DNA test the hospital automatically filed whenever a child death occurred. Elliot said he refused the first time, but the man didn't threaten him with violence. He threatened him with something worse. He knew Elliot had gambling debts. He knew Elliot had once written the wrong prescription for a patient 2 years earlier and covered it up. And he said, very simply, sign, then forget, or I'll make sure you don't just lose your license, you lose your freedom. Elliot signed, took the money, canceled the DNA request, wrote in the file that the child who died was Grant Hale's, based on visual identification and matching physical traits, and the child who lived, the child who was truly Grant's, the child with the leaf-shaped birthmark and the thin glass scar, was entered into the system as an unnamed child, then transferred out through a route Elliot didn't fully know but believed ran through an adoption agency, vanishing from the hospital records as if the baby had never existed. Hannah sat in the chair across from him, arms wrapped tight around Maisie, and as Elliot spoke, she didn't say a word, but her face shifted through each stage like someone being pushed slowly underwater, from confusion to fear to refusal, and finally into something beyond fear. Something like realizing the ground beneath her feet had just disappeared. Because Hannah wasn't stupid. She was poor. She was tired. Life had shoved her to the edge. But she wasn't stupid. And she was sitting here with a child who had a leaf-shaped birthmark on her shoulder. A child she'd adopted through a small, obscure agency when the girl was still under 1 year old. And across from her sat a man a doctor had just said was tricked into burying the wrong child 5 years ago. And everything was clicking together in a way she didn't want it to. Because if it clicked, if Maisie really was Grant Hale's biological daughter, then who was she? Hannah Mercer, the mother who had raised that child since she was tiny, who'd stayed up all night when she had a fever, who'd gone hungry so her child could have porridge, who'd held her while they slept on a bus seat in the middle of winter. What was she supposed to be in this story? Hannah's hands shook as she reached down for the backpack by her chair, unzipped the bottom compartment, and pulled out the wrinkled adoption envelope she'd kept for nearly 5 years. She opened it, for the first time not to read her child's name, but to look for something she'd never paid attention to before. The identification number line in the upper left corner of the first page, beneath the agency logo, a string of letters and numbers she'd always assumed was a court case code. But now, in an exam room that smelled of disinfectant and truth peeling open layer by layer like skin, Hannah stared at that code and realized it didn't match any court code she'd ever seen on other legal paperwork. It had a 2-letter prefix and 6 digits, the kind of code she'd seen printed on patient wristbands and in the top corner of medical charts when she took Maisie for vaccines at the community clinic. It wasn't a court code. It was a hospital internal code. Hannah lifted her head, looked at Elliot, looked at Grant, and when she spoke, it came out as a whisper. Yet it rang through the room like a bell. The number on my child's adoption papers isn't from a court. It looks like a hospital code. Why would my child's adoption papers have a hospital code? Hannah's question hung in the air of the exam room like a blade just drawn, and Elliot Vance stared at the adoption papers in her hand, with the eyes of a man who had just seen the final piece of a picture he'd spent 5 years trying not to see. Grant stood motionless, but his gaze moved from Elliot to Hannah to the paper. And in that instant, something changed in the way he looked at the gaunt woman holding her daughter on her lap, because the question she'd asked wasn't the question of a panicked mother. It was the question of someone who could see, who could read, who could tell the difference, and that sharpness made Grant realize Hannah Mercer wasn't only a victim of circumstance. She was a thinking woman, buried by poverty but not destroyed by it. Hannah didn't wait for anyone to answer. She rose, laid sleeping Maisie gently on a chair, rolled her own coat into a pillow for the child, then turned to Elliot with a look Grant had never seen on her before. Not fear, not pleading, but resolve. "You're a doctor here," she said to Elliot, her voice still trembling, yet each word packed tight, like a round in a chamber. "You can access the records archive. The code on my adoption papers looks like an internal medical code, and if it's truly a hospital code, then the original file has to be somewhere in your system. I need to get into that archive. I need to compare." Grant watched her, and for the first time since they'd met at the Iron Gate on that snowy night, he didn't look at her as someone weak who needed shelter, or a stranger who needed watching. He looked at her like someone standing on the same side of the line, even if neither of them had admitted it yet. Elliot hesitated, his hands opening and closing, but Grant said only 2 words: "Lead the way." It wasn't a request. It was the last command before his patience ran out. The records archive was in the hospital basement, at the end of a long corridor where fluorescent lights flickered, the air cold and damp, the smell of old paper mixed with rusted pipes. Elliot swiped his staff badge to open the door, his hand shaking so badly he had to try 3 times before it finally let them in. And inside were rows of steel shelving that rose to the ceiling, packed with cardboard file boxes sorted by year, by department, by code. Elliot led them to the emergency department records from 5 years ago, found the right month, the right week, and pulled out a box marked with a code that began with 2 letters and 6 digits, the same format as the code on Hannah's adoption papers. Hannah placed the adoption documents beside the hospital file, and she didn't need to be an expert to see it. The 2-letter prefix matched exactly. The number string differed only in the last 2 digits, and when Elliot opened the hospital file, inside was a note reading "Unknown female infant, estimated under 1 year, admitted due to a motor vehicle accident, transferred to pediatrics for 72 hours of observation." And then, instead of further notes about treatment or discharge, there was only a red stamp across the page that read "Adoption Expedite, file transferred under legal authorization," and a jagged signature Elliot recognized immediately. "Adoption Expedite," Hannah read aloud, her voice sinking. "What does that mean?" "It means someone moved her straight from the hospital into the adoption system without a court, without the normal process." Elliot nodded, his face gray under the fluorescent lights. Adoption Expedite is an accelerated procedure, only used for abandoned children, confirmed to have no relatives, and it requires signatures from the attending physician, a social worker, and an authorizing attorney. I signed the physician portion. I don't know who the social worker was, but the authorizing attorney. He stopped, drew a breath, and the name left his mouth as if it tasted bitter: Miles Kerrigan. Grant's expression didn't change, but Caleb, standing just outside the archive door, snapped his head around at the sound of that name, and in his eyes Hannah saw something like confirmation, the look of a man who'd suspected for a long time, and had finally heard the name he'd been waiting for. "Kerrigan," Grant repeated, only 1 word, but the way he said it carried the weight of years of history, years of power, and years of someone hiding in the dark and waiting. Hannah looked from one man to the other. She didn't know who Miles Kerrigan was, but she understood from their reactions that this wasn't a stranger. This was someone Grant knew, someone Caleb knew, and that knowing carried something heavier than hatred. Elliot moved to an ancient computer in the corner of the archive, powered the monitor on, logged in with his staff credentials to access the electronic records system, and searched for Maisie's code in the database. The file appeared, but beside it he clicked a small tab in the corner of the pale blue screen that only an administrator could see. The access log, the audit trail that recorded every time this file had been opened, by whom, from where, and when. The list loaded, most of it old entries from 5 years ago, from Elliot's account, from administrative accounts, all with legitimate reasons. But on the final line, The newest line, the access date displayed clearly, and Elliot froze, his finger hovering above the keyboard, his eyes fixed on the text as if reading his own death sentence. The most recent access was 48 hours ago. The account used was an administrative ID that had been disabled 3 years earlier but was somehow still active. The access location was outside the hospital network, through a remote connection. Someone had opened Maisie's file 2 days ago, right around the time the unmarked vehicle began appearing near Grant's estate. Right around the time Hannah walked her daughter up to doors asking to clean houses for a meal. And that timing wasn't coincidence. It was a chessboard, and someone had been ahead of them by at least 2 moves. Grant stood in front of the computer screen in the records archive, the pale blue glow washing over his face, and the name Miles Kerrigan spun through his mind like a drill punching through the thick concrete he'd poured over the past. He remembered Kerrigan, not the vague memory of someone you haven't seen in years, but the razor-sharp memory of someone who once trusted another person and got betrayed. The kind of remembering etched with acid into bone. Miles Kerrigan, 52 years old, had been Grant's private attorney and right hand for nearly 7 years. The man who handled every legal mess for the organization. The man who turned evidence into ash, turned witnesses into silence, turned million-dollar lawsuits into spotless settlement papers. Kerrigan was the only person besides Caleb who knew about Grant's private life, knew about the child, knew about the small house in the suburbs Grant kept hidden from the rest of the underworld, and that knowledge became a weapon when Grant discovered Kerrigan had been siphoning money from the organization through a system of virtual accounts he'd built himself. Grant hadn't killed Kerrigan. Many people in the organization called that a mistake. He'd only stripped him of power, seized his assets, cut every connection, and pushed him out of the system the way you cut off a rotting limb. Kerrigan disappeared from Chicago after that, and Grant thought it was over, that a man stripped of everything would sink quietly into oblivion like so many before him. But now, standing in the damp, moldy archive of the county hospital with the record of an unauthorized access from 48 hours earlier glowing on the screen, Grant understood he'd been wrong. Kerrigan hadn't vanished. He'd only moved from the light into the dark. And in that dark, he had arranged the crash, bought off a doctor, canceled the DNA test, swapped the files of 2 babies, pushed Grant's biological child into the adoption system, and left Grant to bury a baby who wasn't his, then live inside grief for 5 years. Not for money, not for power, for vengeance, the patient, methodical vengeance of a smart man who'd been stripped of everything and decided the one who stripped him would lose what mattered most. And the fact that he could still access hospital records from outside the system only 48 hours ago meant one clear and terrifying thing. Kerrigan had someone inside. He had planted hands. He had a network Grant still hadn't fully seen, and he wasn't just watching. He was setting up the next move. Grant turned to Caleb. "Where's our vehicle parked?" Caleb pointed toward the underground garage, and the 2 men went down while Hannah stayed in the archive with Maisie asleep in her arms, and Elliot shrinking in the corner like a shadow trying to disappear into the wall. In the garage, Caleb opened the trunk of the black SUV, pulled a small device the size of a matchbox from his coat pocket, switched it on, and began scanning the vehicle in a systematic sweep: front seats, back seats, dashboard, glove compartment, under the seats, door seams. Along the plastic trim beneath the dashboard on the driver's side, the scanner gave a soft beep, and Caleb used 2 fingers to peel off a thin black piece, smaller than a coin, glued to the inside of the trim, so tiny nobody would spot it unless they were looking for it. A listening device. Caleb held it up under the neon lights of the garage, his eyes going dark. "This isn't cheap," he said, his voice tight. "This kind records continuously and transmits data over cellular signal, unlimited range, battery lasts 2 to 3 weeks. Somebody planted it in our vehicle, and if it's been here since before yesterday, then every conversation we had in the car, from when we took Maisie to the emergency room to when we drove back to the estate, has been heard." Grant took the device in his palm, looked at it, then crushed it with one hard squeeze without changing expression, the plastic fragments falling onto the concrete floor of the garage. He didn't say anything, but Caleb read the order in his eyes without needing a word spoken. Sweep the entire estate again, every room, every vehicle, every electronic device, and do it now. When the 2 of them returned to the archive, Hannah was standing beside the file shelves with Maisie in her arms, and she looked at Grant with eyes that were completely different from the eyes of the woman who'd stood at the estate gate asking for housekeeping work in exchange for a meal. In her gaze now there was no pleading, no blind fear, only understanding, the kind that assembled itself piece by piece like a puzzle finally coming into focus. The birthmark on Maisie's shoulder, the swapped records, the cancelled DNA test, the adoption paper carrying a hospital code, the teddy bear dusted with snow at the gate, the unplated car watching the house, the bug in the SUV, and the name Miles Kerrigan, a man she hadn't seen but had started to feel the weight of through every fragment of truth laid out in front of them. "This isn't about a child being mixed up by accident, is it?" Hannah asked, her voice low and slow, as if she were confirming what she already knew rather than truly needing an answer. "Someone did all of this on purpose. Someone took your child, gave her to me, and now they're coming back. This is revenge." Grant looked at her, and in that moment, in the damp records archive under the county hospital, an invisible thread tied two completely different people together, not by affection, not by trust, but by something stronger than both of them, the same enemy. The black SUV left the county hospital at close to 2 in the afternoon. The snow had stopped, but the sky still hung heavy and gray, like a concrete blanket pressing down on the city, and inside the vehicle, the silence was suffocating, because each of them was carrying a piece of truth. No one wanted to be the first to speak aloud. Hannah held Maisie in the backseat. The little girl was awake now, fiddling with the clasp on her mother's coat, her clear eyes unaware that the name on her birth certificate might not be her real name, that the mother holding her might not be her biological mother, and that the man in the front seat was watching her in the rearview mirror with eyes full of a storm he wouldn't allow himself to show. Grant was checking his phone, reading encrypted messages from his contact in the police department about the unmarked car, when Caleb suddenly slowed and spoke in a low, even voice, the kind he used only when he'd spotted a threat. "We've got a problem. Look ahead." Grant lifted his head, and through the windshield he saw his mansion's iron gate standing open. Not opened by remote control the way it usually was, but opened because 2 vehicles were parked directly in front of it. A black and white police cruiser with its red and blue lights off was blocking the entrance, and behind it a plain gray sedan, the kind government agencies often used. 2 uniformed officers stood outside the gate talking to Grant's security guard, and the guard was trying to explain something with a tight, strained face. Hannah saw the police car, and her whole body went rigid. Her hand tightened around Maisie so hard the child looked up at her mother with confused eyes, and in Hannah's mind every worst-case scenario hit at once. They'd come to arrest her for being homeless. They'd come to take Maisie because she wasn't fit to raise a child. They knew she was in a stranger's house, and they were here to separate them. "Stay calm," Grant said without turning around, his voice remaining as level and unreadable as a sheet of dark ice. But Hannah saw his hand on his thigh clench into a fist for a brief moment, and then release. "Caleb, park on the right corner. Don't park at the gate. Kill the engine and wait for me." Caleb did it. The SUV slid into a spot about 30 meters from the gate, tucked behind a line of snow-coated evergreens, and Grant stepped out alone, adjusted the collar of his coat, and walked toward the 2 officers with the unhurried pace of a homeowner returning from a stroll. Not fast, not slow, nothing suspicious. The older officer turned to face him as he approached, his hand drifting to his belt by reflex, and asked, "Are you the owner of this house?" Grant nodded and gave a name, not his real one, but the name on the property ownership documents his lawyer had carefully arranged through 3 layers of shell companies. "We received an anonymous call," the officer said, his voice even in that procedural way, like he was reading a checklist. "The caller reported that at this address there's a woman and a child being held against their will, and the child may be in danger. By policy, we have to check." Grant didn't change expression, but inside he recognized it immediately as Kerrigan's next move. He didn't need to break in. He didn't need to hire a hitman. He didn't need a direct confrontation. All he had to do was make one anonymous phone call and let the legal system do the rest. Clean, no fingerprints, completely lawful. "No one is being held against their will here," Grant replied, calm and cooperative enough not to raise suspicion. "I have a friend and her daughter staying with me. The child was mildly ill, so they're resting here for a few days. You can verify if you need to, but I want to call my attorney first, because that's my right." The officer looked at his partner, then back at Grant, and in his eyes was the hesitation of someone who knew he was standing at the gate of someone not ordinary, the kind of 3-meter iron gate with security cameras everywhere that didn't belong to an ordinary man. But procedure was procedure. Go ahead and call your lawyer, the officer said. But we're not leaving until we confirm the child is safe. In the SUV, Hannah heard most of the exchange through the slightly open window, and she was shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but because every word the officer said was the largest nightmare of her life. Someone was trying to take her from Maisie using the very system she had no money, no power, no one to fight. Caleb turned to look at her, and for the first time his voice wasn't cold. It carried something close to urgency. Listen to me. Don't get out of the vehicle until Grant tells you. Don't say anything to the police without a lawyer present. Don't cry. Don't panic. Don't let them see you're afraid. Because fear is what makes them think you've got something to hide. Hold your child, stay steady, and believe me when I tell you Grant won't let anyone take her. Hannah looked at Caleb, and she wanted to ask why she should trust him, why she should trust anyone in this world when everything she'd ever trusted had collapsed. But she didn't ask because Maisie was clutching her coat tie, and her daughter's eyes were on her with the absolute trust only children have. And if Hannah broke now, who would be the wall between this child and the world? 20 minutes later, Grant's attorney arrived, a white-haired man in a gray suit, stepping out of a black Mercedes, speaking briefly with the officers, and it looked as if everything might be smoothed over quietly when another vehicle appeared and parked behind the cruiser, and from the driver's seat stepped a middle-aged woman in a brown coat, holding a file case, and around her neck hung a staff badge with 4 letters that Hannah saw through the glass and felt her blood turn to ice. DCFS, Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. And the woman walked forward with the sure steps of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, opened her case, pulled out a sheet of paper, and spoke to Grant and his attorney in a voice that was polite, but not negotiable. I have an order for a child welfare check under Section 25 of the Illinois Child Protection Act. I need to see the child, speak with the guardian, and inspect the living conditions within 24 hours, and this isn't a request. This is an order. The DCFS worker was named Margaret Thornton, a woman around 50 with brown hair clipped neatly at the nape of her neck, small eyes behind black-framed glasses that swept over everything with the cold precision of someone who had watched too many families break apart to be moved anymore by tears or explanations. She stepped into the guest wing of the estate, where Hannah and Maisie were staying, her gaze moving from the living room to the kitchen to the bedroom, jotting quick notes in a small notebook. Then she sat in the chair across from Hannah with an open case file on her lap and began to ask questions, one by one, her voice steady and mechanical, not cruel but leaving no room for warmth. Full legal name of the guardian, permanent address, employment, income, criminal record, the child's medical history, birth certificate, adoption papers. Hannah answered each question, trying to keep her voice even, but every question was a cut into the softest part of her life, because every answer exposed the truths she'd tried to hide. No permanent address because she was homeless. No income because she'd lost her job 3 months earlier. No medical records for Maisie because she hadn't had money for regular checkups for nearly a year. And when Margaret asked about the adoption papers, Hannah pulled the wrinkled envelope from her backpack and set it on the table with a faint tremor in her hand, because she knew that paper was the only thing that proved she was Maisie's mother. And if it wasn't enough, she had nothing else. Margaret opened the envelope, read page after page, and when she stopped on the first sheet, the eyes behind the black frames narrowed. She turned the page, read more, then set the papers down and looked at Hannah with a look Hannah recognized instantly because she'd seen it on too many faces before. Suspicion. The agency that issued these adoption papers, Margaret said, slow and clear, is not on the list of licensed adoption organizations in the state of Illinois. The case number format on this document does not match any format used by the family court system. And the verification seal on the last page, she flipped to the last sheet and pointed to a faint circular stamp in the lower right corner, is not in the legal seal database I can access right now. That does not mean these papers are fake, but it does mean they are flagged as questionable until they can be verified. Hannah felt the floor tilt beneath her. Questionable. The paper she had held onto like a lifeline for nearly 5 years, the paper she believed was undeniable proof that Maisie was hers, had just been flagged as questionable, with one cold word and a red ballpoint mark in the corner of the page. She wanted to stand, to snatch the papers back, to shout in Margaret's face that she'd raised that child since she could do nothing but cry and drink from a bottle, that she'd gone hungry so her child could have milk, that no piece of paper on earth could prove motherhood the way those nights proved it. The nights she'd stayed awake holding a feverish child in a shelter through winter, but she didn't shout because Caleb's voice echoed in her head like an order. Don't cry. Don't panic. Don't let them see you're afraid. She swallowed her tears, sat up straight, and spoke in a voice she had to hold together with the last of her strength. I adopted Maisie through a lawful agency. I have all the paperwork they gave me. If there's an issue with the agency, that's the agency's fault, not mine, and it's not a reason to take my child from me. Margaret looked at her, neither sympathetic nor cold, only neutral in the strict sense of a law enforcement agent. Then she turned toward Grant and his attorney standing in the doorway. Grant's lawyer, Victor Ashworth, had intervened from the beginning by insisting Margaret follow proper procedure, not ask beyond the scope of the welfare check, and by stating for the record that his client, Grant under the name listed on the property documents, was voluntarily providing temporary shelter to an acquaintance and her daughter, with no sign of confinement or abuse. But Victor knew, and Grant knew, that legal interference could only slow the process, not stop it, because CPS held a special kind of authority when children were involved, and that authority did not require a court order to take the first step. Margaret finished the check, closed her notebook, scanned the room one more time, then delivered the decision Hannah had feared from the moment she saw the DCFS badge hanging from Margaret's neck. Based on the factors currently present, Margaret said, her voice still even, her cadence unchanged, as if she were reading a page from a procedural manual, instead of declaring something that could destroy a family, including the report that was called in, the guardian's homelessness, the lack of medical records for the child, and the adoption papers showing irregularities that must be verified. I am placing the child under temporary protective supervision for 72 hours at a DCFS assessment facility for a medical exam, an in-depth interview, and record verification. This is an administrative decision, not a court ruling, and the guardian has the right to appeal within 24 hours. Hannah shot to her feet, the chair tipping backward, the crack of it hitting the floor sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. No, she said, one word. But it carried the weight of her whole life, of every sleepless night, every meal she'd given up, every step she'd taken over cold snow. No, you can't take my child. Grant stood in the doorway, watching Hannah fold over Maisie and hold her tight, watching Margaret calmly pull out her phone to call for a transport unit, watching Victor give him a slight shake of the head that meant, I can't block this step. And inside Grant's chest, something flared and froze at the same time, because he was watching a child who might be his biological daughter about to be taken by the very system his enemy was manipulating. And this time, money, power, or threats wouldn't help, because his opponent wasn't a person. His opponent was the law. The DCFS vehicle arrived 15 minutes after Margaret's call, a plain white minivan that parked right in front of the guest wing door, and a young female worker stepped out, carrying a brand new child safety seat with the tags still on it. And it was that detail, the safety seat prepared in advance, spotless, the exact size, that made Grant realize everything had been arranged ahead of time. The anonymous call wasn't random. Margaret hadn't shown up by coincidence. The seat hadn't been grabbed carelessly from a storeroom. It all fit together like a machine that had been wound, and was simply waiting for the right moment to run. Hannah stood in the middle of the living room with Maisie in her arms, and the little girl was crying, not because she understood what was happening, but because she could feel her mother's heart hammering wildly through the chest pressed against her, could feel her mother's hands shaking on her back, could sense that something was wrong, very wrong, with the pure instinct of a 5-year-old who didn't need anyone to explain it. Margaret stepped forward, her voice still level and professional. She told Hannah this was only temporary. 72 hours. The child would be well cared for, examined by doctors, placed in a clean room, and Hannah would have the right to call once a day. But every word temporary and right to call landed in Hannah's ears like stones dropped into a bottomless well. Because to a mother who had lost everything and had only one child left in her arms, there was no such thing as temporary when someone took a child from her. Hannah didn't resist with violence. She didn't hit, didn't shove, didn't run, because she knew any act like that would be written into the file and become the reason they kept Maisie longer than 72 hours. Much longer. She only held her child a little tighter for a moment, her face buried in Maisie's hair, her lips whispering into her daughter's ear words no one else in the room could make out. Maybe I'll come get you. Maybe don't be afraid. Maybe words only the two of them knew. And then she set Maisie down, knelt, took her child's tiny hands, looked into her eyes with the most trembling smile a mother could force onto her face, and said, You go with this lady for a little bit. I'll come pick you up soon. You remember to count the steps, count to 10, and I'll be there." Maisie nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks, her small hand gripping the tie of her mother's coat, and then slowly letting go. And the instant those tiny fingers released the strip of fabric, Hannah felt as if someone had pulled a part of her body out without anesthesia. The DCFS worker lifted Maisie. The child didn't struggle, but she craned her neck to look back at her mother, eyes wide, and the last "mom" from her mouth echoed in the living room as the door closed behind them. Hannah collapsed to the floor, not screaming, not wailing, only collapsing like a tree cut through at the trunk, her knees hitting the wood, her arms wrapping her stomach, her whole body folding into a small, trembling shape without sound. Grant stood at the door watching the white minivan roll slowly out through the gate with Maisie inside, and he didn't speak, didn't move, only stood there like a statue. But Caleb beside him saw what no one else saw. The corner of Grant's eye was wet, only for a moment. A thin sheen like mist passing over and then gone. But it was there, and Caleb knew this was the second time in Grant Hale's life he'd lost a child. The first time in a morgue 5 years ago, this time in his own living room. And both times he'd been helpless in the same way. Both times he'd stood and watched in the same way. Both times unable to do anything, but let the pain eat him from the inside out. 10 minutes after the minivan disappeared, Grant's phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed on the screen, and when he answered, Elliot Vance's voice came through, breathless, panicked, like a man running or hiding. "Someone went into the archive after we left. I checked the system again, and the original file from the crash night has been flagged for transfer, which means it'll be boxed and moved to the central storage within 24 hours, and once it's in central storage, you need a court order to get it back. And a court order takes weeks. You have to move fast. They're wiping the trail." Grant listened, his fingers tightening around the phone. Then he turned to look at Hannah, still crumpled on the floor, hair over her face, shoulders shaking, and he walked over, knelt beside her, and spoke in a voice he hadn't used with anyone in years. A voice that wasn't an order, wasn't cold, almost a plea. "Hannah, get up. We've got 72 hours. Hannah lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen and red, her face soaked, but something in Grant's words struck the most unbreakable part of her, the part life had never managed to snap no matter how many times it tried. She stood, trembling but upright, and as she wiped her face with her sleeve, her mind started working again, not slowly, but flaring on all at once like a light switching on in a dark room. And she remembered something, a small detail she'd read hundreds of times on the adoption papers and had never questioned. She pulled the envelope out, turned to the last page where the parties' signatures were, and her finger stopped on the witness line. A name written in neat black ink, all capital letters. Patricia Holloway, social worker, Cook County. Hannah stared at the name, then looked at Grant, her voice hoarse but razor sharp. "The witness signature on my adoption papers is Patricia Holloway, a Cook County social worker. I remember because I've read it 1,000 times. But when I got Maisie, the person who handed her to me was a man, not a woman, and he said he was the agency's attorney, not a social worker. I've never met anyone named Patricia Holloway. That name has never existed in my life. So who signed?" Hannah didn't wait for Grant to give an order. She didn't wait for the lawyer to make a plan. She didn't wait for anyone to grant permission. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, threw on her coat, and spoke to Grant in a voice he'd never heard from her before, the voice of someone who'd hit bottom and discovered that beneath the bottom there was a layer harder than stone she'd never known she possessed. "I know where I got Maisie. I know the address. I remember every detail because it was the most important day of my life, and I'm going there now. Whether you come with me or not is your choice." Grant looked at her, and in that split second he made a decision Caleb would later remember as the moment everything changed. He didn't stop her. He didn't order her to stay. He didn't send someone in her place. He grabbed his coat and followed her out the door, because he realized Hannah knew things he didn't. She had memory, an address, faces, details no one in his system could provide, and in this 72-hour race, she wasn't the one who needed protecting. She was the guide. In the car, Hannah directed Caleb to a neighborhood on Chicago's southwest side, a suburban stretch where low buildings sat shoulder to shoulder, with laundromats and small diners, and she pointed to a 2-story brown brick office building with dark-tinted glass on the ground floor, the place she'd walked into nearly 5 years earlier, with her heart pounding out of control, and walked out with a baby in her arms. But when they arrived, The dark glass no longer carried the words Bright Horizon Family Services the way Hannah remembered. Instead, there was a sign for a small accounting firm, and when Grant pushed inside and questioned the receptionist, the young woman behind the desk said the accounting firm had leased the space for more than 3 years. Who the previous tenant had been, she didn't know. The building owner was out of state. Hannah stood in the waiting area of the accounting office, staring at walls freshly painted a pale cream that she knew had been light blue 5 years ago, staring at the reception counter where a middle-aged blonde woman had once handed her a stack of paperwork to sign, and a warm smile Hannah now realized might have been the smile of an accomplice. And she felt like she was standing at the scene of a crime, where the killer had cleaned away every trace before the victim could ever return. But Hannah didn't stop there. She pulled an old phone from her coat pocket, a cheap device she'd kept for years because she couldn't afford a new one, and she opened her email folder, scrolling back nearly 5 years, past hundreds of spam messages and debt notices, until she found a thread from info@breakthhorizonfamily.com, 4 emails in all, one confirming an appointment, one listing the documents she needed to bring, one sending a service fee receipt, and the final email, sent after she received Maisie, thanking her for having completed the process and attaching a PDF she'd never opened because she assumed it was just another copy of the paperwork. Hannah opened the PDF on her phone, her hands shaking so badly she had to hold the device with both of them, and inside it wasn't a copy of adoption papers the way she'd believed. It was a 1-page information sheet about Bright Horizons adoption facilitation service, and at the bottom there was a small paragraph printed in 8-point font, easy to miss unless you forced yourself to read it. Legal services provided by partner attorney, Kerrigan and Associates, licensed attorney at law. Hannah handed the phone to Grant, and when he read that line, his face didn't change, but his jaw tightened until the muscle at his temple stood out under the skin, and Caleb, standing behind him, leaned over his shoulder and saw the same name, Kerrigan and Associates. Tiny words at the bottom of the page, hidden inside a pile of meaningless information, but they were the thread that ran straight from a shadowy adoption agency to Miles Kerrigan, from the baby swapped in the hospital to the adoption envelope in Hannah's hands. From the past, Grant thought he'd buried to the present he was living, and that thread wasn't hidden anymore. It was sitting on the screen of a cheap phone in the hands of a homeless mother, clear as daylight. Grant looked at Hannah, and for the first time he spoke to her in a voice that wasn't an order, wasn't reassurance, but acknowledgement. "You found what my whole team didn't find in 5 years." Hannah didn't react to the compliment because she didn't need praise. She needed her daughter, and now she had proof. She had the emails, she had the receipt, she had Kerrigan's name printed in black on white, and she had 68 hours left to turn those things into a weapon that would bring Maisie back. But digital evidence could be erased. Emails could be denied. Receipts could be dismissed as forged. And Grant knew that to bring Kerrigan down, he needed the one thing no lawyer could argue away, a confession from Kerrigan's own mouth. He pulled out his phone, called Victor Ashworth, and delivered 4 clipped sentences. "I need a private meeting with Miles Kerrigan. Legal. Recorded. Within 24 hours." Victor Ashworth called Grant back within 2 hours with information Grant both wanted to hear and didn't want to hear. Miles Kerrigan wasn't hiding. He was living right in Chicago, under his real name, in a penthouse in the Gold Coast, working openly as an independent legal consultant for private equity funds, and he had a polished professional website, a portrait photo in an expensive gray suit, the confident smile of a man who lived well and slept soundly, with no trace of someone lurking in the shadows or afraid of being found. Kerrigan wasn't running because he didn't believe he needed to. He'd erased every trail, bought every witness, shut down the agency, transferred the files, and let Grant live in the dark for 5 years without ever suspecting. And that confidence, Grant knew, was Kerrigan's biggest weakness, because confident men didn't defend themselves, and men who didn't defend themselves fell into traps. Grant didn't choose a gun. He didn't choose violence. He didn't choose the way his underworld would have chosen, because he knew a bullet in Kerrigan's head wouldn't bring Maisie back, wouldn't erase the CPS record, wouldn't prove the adoption papers were forged, and would turn him from victim into criminal in the eyes of the law, exactly what Kerrigan wanted. Instead, he chose a clean trap, the kind he used in his most important underground negotiations. He would create a controlled meeting in a lawful setting, with recording equipment permitted under Illinois law, because Illinois is a one-party consent state, meaning only one person in the conversation has to know it's being recorded for the recording to carry legal weight. Victor arranged the location, a a private meeting room at Alinea, a restaurant where Grant had ties to the owner, soundproofed, one entrance, 2 security cameras already installed in the restaurant's system that Grant had asked them to angle, so they covered the entire table, plus a small recording device tucked into the lapel flower on the suit of the person attending the meeting. But a trap needed bait, and the bait couldn't be Grant, because Kerrigan knew Grant too well. He knew the way Grant spoke, the way he pressed, the way he controlled, and he would never slip up in front of an opponent he'd studied for years. The bait had to be something Kerrigan wouldn't guard against, something that made him feel he was winning, controlling, watching a victim kneel, and that bait was Hannah. Grant made the proposal to Hannah that night in the mansion living room, while she sat on the sofa with swollen eyes staring into nothing, her hand unconsciously gripping the tie of the coat Maisie used to tug, gripping empty air because the child wasn't there. He explained the plan, without dressing it up, without softening it. She would be present at the meeting with Kerrigan and play the role of a desperate mother begging him to withdraw the CPS report. She would cry. She would plead. She would let him feel powerful. And in that process, she would ask the right questions. Questions Victor had drafted in advance, designed to guide Kerrigan into saying what he'd done, into admitting it while believing he was boasting. Hannah listened in silence for a long time, then looked at Grant and said, "I don't need to play a role. I'm a mother whose child was stolen. That isn't acting. That's the truth." Grant nodded, and between them, in that moment, there was an understanding that didn't need words. She was stepping into danger not because she trusted Grant, but because she had no other choice. And he was letting her step into danger not because he didn't care, but because he knew she was the only weapon Kerrigan wouldn't anticipate. Victor contacted Kerrigan by attorney email, proposing an informal meeting to discuss a misunderstanding related to a CPS report that one of Victor's clients believed might involve Kerrigan, language chosen carefully to hint that Grant knew he was behind it, while staying vague enough not to become a direct accusation. Kerrigan replied within 4 hours, faster than Grant expected, and that alone confirmed he was watching the situation closely and wanted to know exactly how much Grant knew. But Kerrigan's response email included a condition Grant hadn't anticipated. He agreed to meet, but not at the restaurant, not with a lawyer, not with Grant. He wanted to meet the mother, only the 2 of them, at a location he would name 1 hour beforehand. No third party, no lawyer, no security. He wants to control the playing field, Caleb said, his voice tight as a string. If Hannah goes alone, we can't protect her. Grant stared at the email on the screen, then looked at Hannah, and she was looking back at him, her eyes not afraid, or if they were afraid, she'd learned to stand steady on fear the way you stood on ice. And she said, "If he wants to meet me, fine, I'll go. But I need you to guarantee one thing, no matter what happens in that meeting, no matter what he says about Maisie, about me, about you, when it's over, the child comes back to me, not to you, to me." The room went silent, and Grant Hale, the man who had lost his child once and might now be standing in front of the only chance he would ever have to get that child back, looked into the eyes of the woman who had raised his child for 5 years and nodded, a slow, heavy nod, like signing a commitment he knew would tear him apart from the inside. Yet he nodded anyway, because it was right, and because it was the thing Grant Hale had buried deepest in himself that was now finding its way back to the surface. Kerrigan changed the location at the last minute. Not a restaurant, but a private cafe on the 2nd floor of an old building in Wicker Park, the kind of place that only took reservations and had private rooms divided by frosted glass partitions. And Victor Ashworth had only 40 minutes to contact the owner, a man who owed Grant a favor from years ago, to adjust the existing security cameras in the room so the angle covered the entire table and the audio would be clear enough. Legal under Illinois law because Hannah knew about and agreed to the recording. She was one party in the conversation, and that was enough for everything captured to carry weight in court. Hannah arrived 10 minutes early, sat at the table in the private room, in front of her a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and both hands resting in her lap that she had to press down hard so they wouldn't shake. Inside her coat was a small recorder, about half a finger, long clipped into her chest pocket, and in the cafe across the street, Grant and Caleb sat in a vehicle with a laptop connected directly to the camera feed inside the room, seeing everything, hearing everything, but unable to intervene if anything happened, because Kerrigan demanded only 2 people, and any appearance by a third party would make him leave immediately. Miles Kerrigan walked in at 3 o'clock sharp, and Hannah's first feeling was disappointment, because she'd imagined a villain would look like a villain, but Kerrigan looked like a university professor or a family doctor, 52 years old. Salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a light gray suit, a dark blue tie, healthy pink skin, a polite smile as he pulled out the chair and sat across from her, and his eyes, cold gray behind gold-rimmed glasses, studied Hannah with a mild curiosity, like he was watching a small animal in a glass cage. "You're Hannah," he said, not as a question, his voice deep and warm, the kind of voice used to persuade. "I know more about you than you think. You've raised the girl well, truly. I'm not being sarcastic." Hannah swallowed, remembering what Victor had told her. Let him talk, let him lead, let him feel like he's winning, and only ask when he's comfortable enough to forget that words have weight. "I'm here because of my child," Hannah said, her voice shaking just enough. Not acting but real, because every second she sat here was a second Maisie was inside a DCFS facility without her mother. "CPS took my child. I know that report call is connected to you. I just want to know why, and I want my child back." Kerrigan tilted his head, his fingers tapping lightly on the tabletop, and his smile didn't vanish. It only shifted from polite to something almost satisfied, the smile of someone watching a play he'd written himself. "I didn't call CPS," he said gently, then leaned forward. "But suppose, just suppose, someone did. Then what do you think the reason was? Do you think a person would spend 5 years, Hannah, arranging everything, from the temporary ID in the hospital to canceling the DNA test, to a donation to the emergency department so people would close their eyes, to choosing the right young woman, poor, alone, with no family, to adopt the baby? Do you think that person did it for money? No, that person did it for justice." Hannah felt nausea rise, but she didn't let it show. She swallowed it down, held his gaze, and asked in a voice she hoped sounded curious rather than furious. "Justice for who?" Kerrigan leaned back, and this was the moment his smugness swallowed his caution, because he'd waited 5 years for someone to ask that question, waited 5 years to explain his masterpiece, and he couldn't resist. "Grant Hale took everything from me," he said, his voice still even, but his eyes lit in a way Hannah recognized as dangerous. Dangerous because it was the light of fanaticism. Money, reputation, position, all of it, in one night, like flipping a switch. "So I took from him the one thing money can't buy back. I didn't kill the girl. I'm not a monster. I only made sure he believed his child was dead, buried her, grieved her, and then lived the rest of his life with that hole in his chest. And the girl grew up with a broke mother in the suburbs, never knowing who she was. That's justice, an eye for an eye." Hannah clenched her hands under the table until her nails cut into her palms, but she didn't stop. She pushed further, her voice smaller as if she were truly afraid. "But how did you choose me? How did you know I wouldn't ask questions?" And Kerrigan laughed, a soft, confident laugh, and said, "I didn't pick at random, Hannah. I had people comb lists of young women applying through small agencies, looking for someone with no family, no lawyer, nobody to ask, someone who'd take any child placed in her arms without questions, because she wanted a baby too badly. You were perfect. You were alone. You were poor. And you loved so blindly. That's why I chose you." In the vehicle across the street, Grant heard every word through the laptop speakers, and his hand curled into a fist on his thigh, white-knuckled, trembling slightly, but he didn't move, didn't charge across the road, didn't do anything except stare at the screen where the camera was recording every frame, every word, every shift in Kerrigan's face, as he tightened the noose around his own neck without knowing it. Hannah was about to ask one more question, the final one Victor had prepared, but she didn't get the chance, because Kerrigan suddenly stopped, the gray eyes behind his gold-rimmed glasses flicking upward toward a corner of the ceiling, where a tiny black dot sat almost invisible between the ceiling trim and the wall, and his expression changed, not slowly but in a single beat, from smug to recognition, from recognition to calculation, from calculation to something cold and dangerous, and he looked back at Hannah, the smile gone completely, replaced by the flat face of a man who'd realized he'd said too much, and when he spoke, his voice was nothing but a sharp whisper. "You didn't come here alone." Hannah left the coffee shop 30 seconds after Kerrigan stood and slipped out the back door without looking back, his hand shoved into his suit vest pocket, but his stride faster than normal, the stride of a man calculating how much time he had left to erase tracks before what he'd just said turned into an indictment. Grant and Caleb met Hannah at the front entrance. She got into the car with a face gone white, but her eyes burning bright. The kind of bright you saw in someone who'd walked through fire and knew she hadn't burned. And the first thing she said was, "He confessed to everything, didn't he? It's all on camera." Grant nodded. The laptop on his knees was still running. The video file had been backed up 3 times in less than 2 minutes after Kerrigan left the room. 1 copy on an encrypted drive, 1 copy in the cloud through Grant's private server, 1 copy sent straight to Victor Ashworth through secure email. Because Grant knew that from the moment Kerrigan realized there were cameras, he would do anything to destroy the evidence. And anything in Kerrigan's dictionary included things ordinary people couldn't imagine. The 72-hour clock had been running for nearly 38 hours. That left 34 hours before DCFS either returned Maisie or extended supervision, and if they extended it, the process would shift to family court, lawyers, a hearing, a judge, and that road could drag on for weeks, months, long enough for Kerrigan to wipe every trace and turn Hannah into a homeless mother with forged adoption papers and no legal ground to keep her child. Victor Ashworth moved faster than he ever had in 40 years of practice. He called the Cook County State's Attorney's Office directly, not the main line but the private number of Deputy State's Attorney Patricia Wells, a woman Victor had worked with on 2 major cases before, and trusted enough to speak plainly to. "I have video evidence of a subject confessing to document fraud, bribery of medical staff, destruction of DNA evidence, and the orchestration of an illegal adoption of a child connected to a motor vehicle accident 5 years ago. I need to see you within 3 hours. And I have a physician witness ready to testify under oath." Patricia Wells went quiet for 5 seconds, then said, "Bring everything to my office at 7 tonight." The hardest part wasn't convincing a prosecutor. The hardest part was convincing Elliot Vance to step out of the shell of fear he'd been hiding inside for 5 years and into the light. Grant called Elliot, and the doctor answered in the voice of a man standing on a ledge. "If I testify, Kerrigan will kill me," Grant replied in a voice that wasn't a promise, wasn't a threat, only naked truth. "If you don't testify, he'll erase every trace, and you'll live the rest of your life knowing you helped steal a child from a father and turned a little girl into a pawn. And no one on earth will ever know, but you will know, every night, every morning, until you die. Do you want to live like that, or do you want to end it today?" Elliot was silent for 30 seconds, the longest 30 seconds Grant had ever counted. Then he said, "I'll come." At 7 that evening, Victor, Grant under the identity on his property paperwork, Elliot Vance, and Hannah sat in Deputy State's Attorney Patricia Wells's office, a small room stacked with files, its window looking out onto a dark parking lot. Patricia watched the video file, listened to every word Kerrigan said, read the hospital record Elliot brought, reviewed Hannah's emails and receipts from the Bright Horizon agency, matched the code on the adoption papers to the hospital code, and when she looked up after 40 minutes of reading, her face was the face of a prosecutor who had just found the biggest case of her career. She called DCFS immediately and ordered a pause on every process connected to Maisie until further notice from the state's attorney's office. Then she turned to Hannah and said, "I need you at the DCFS office in person tomorrow morning. Bring every original document. Tell the assigned caseworker everything again, and request a review of the temporary supervision decision based on new evidence. I'll send an official letter to DCFS before 8 in the morning." Hannah arrived at the DCFS office at 8:15 the next morning. Victor came with her as counsel, and they sat in a small meeting room across from Margaret Thornton, the woman who had signed the order to remove Maisie 2 days earlier. Hannah placed each item on the table one by one: the original adoption papers with a hospital code instead of a court code, emails from Bright Horizon with fine print tying back to Kerrigan and Associates, service fee receipts from an agency that had no license, and a copy of the letter from the state's attorney's office confirming an active investigation. Margaret read every page. Her expression didn't change much, but the pace of her page turning slowed, as if each sheet were heavier than the last. And when she finished, she set her glasses down, looked at Hannah, and said she needed to consult her supervisors and would respond within 4 hours. 4 hours. Hannah didn't have 4 hours in her emotions, but she had 4 hours on the clock, and she sat in the DCFS hallway to wait, spine straight, eyes fixed on the meeting room door, not eating, not drinking, not using the restroom, only waiting. And in those 4 hours, Caleb, stationed outside the building tracking everyone coming and going, saw something that made him pull out his phone and call Grant immediately. A young DCFS staffer, someone Caleb recognized as having been there with Margaret during the check at the mansion, slipped out the back exit, glanced around, then pulled out her phone to call someone, and Caleb, using a telephoto lens from inside his vehicle, caught the phone screen for a split second as she tilted it, and the contact name displayed there was clear and unmistakable. Me, Kerrigan. The photo Caleb had taken of the DCFS employee's phone screen, with the name M. Kerrigan on it, became the final piece that shattered the entire wall. Miles Kerrigan had spent 5 years building. Victor Ashworth sent that photo to Deputy State's Attorney Patricia Wells within 10 minutes, along with a request for an internal DCFS investigation, and Patricia, a woman who'd seen plenty of filth inside the system, but had never seen an infiltration so deep it planted someone inside the agency. Meant to protect children, moved with the kind of speed only the best prosecutors ever do. She obtained an emergency order from the judge on overnight duty, and at 6 o'clock in the morning on the third day, 12 hours before the 72-hour temporary supervision window expired, federal agents and Cook County officers executed 3 arrests at once. Miles Kerrigan was taken in at his penthouse in the Gold Coast while he sat drinking morning coffee in a silk robe, and the expression on his face as 2 officers cuffed him wasn't fear. It was cold outrage, the outrage of a man who couldn't believe the world dared to touch him. A young DCFS employee was arrested at home with evidence of wire transfers from an account later traced to a shell company owned by Kerrigan, and a county hospital administrative staffer, the one who'd used a deactivated ID to access Maisie's records 48 hours earlier, was arrested at the hospital just as the work shift began. The indictment against Kerrigan ran 14 pages. Falsifying adoption documents, bribing medical personnel, unlawful interference with legal records, destruction of DNA evidence, arranging illegal adoption facilitation through an unlicensed agency, planting an operative inside a government agency, and conspiracy to harm a child's mental and physical welfare. Each count another brick in the prison wall Kerrigan would sit behind for years, and that wall was built from his own confession inside the cafe, from the smugness he couldn't restrain in front of a mother he'd believed was weak. At 10 o'clock that morning, a white minivan pulled up in front of the DCFS office, and Maisie was brought out, hair neatly brushed, dressed in new clothes the assessment facility had provided, but her eyes swept the parking lot with the frantic, searching look of a child who'd been separated from her mother for nearly 3 days. And when she spotted Hannah standing at the entrance, everything on that 5-year-old face broke at once. Tears, a smile, the word mom, ringing across the lot, and Maisie ran on tiny legs over the concrete, stumbled once and almost fell but didn't stop, until she crashed into Hannah's arms, and mother and daughter clung to each other in the sun-soaked parking lot, holding so tightly it was impossible to tell who was holding whom. Hannah dropped to her knees, her face buried in her child's hair, tears streaming. But this time they weren't tears of pain. They weren't tears of fear. They were the tears of someone who'd just gotten back the most precious thing on earth after believing it was gone. Grant stood beside the black SUV a few steps away, watching. He didn't step forward. He didn't insert himself. He didn't declare ownership. He simply stood there with both hands in his coat pockets. Eyes on the child a DNA test now pending would confirm was his biological daughter. And on the face of Grant Hale, a man long defined by his stoic ruthlessness, something finally fractured. Not much, only enough for Caleb standing beside him to notice and turn his head away, because he didn't want to see his boss in the most vulnerable moment of his life. 3 weeks later, when the DNA results confirmed Maisie was Grant's biological child, Victor Ashworth prepared the paperwork for Grant to formalize his paternity through family court, and everyone in Grant's circle assumed the next step was obvious. Strip Hannah of guardianship, because her adoption papers had been proven the product of an illegal pipeline. But Grant didn't do it. He invited Hannah into the estate's living room, the same room where weeks earlier she'd collapsed onto the floor when Maisie was taken, and he made an offer Victor called unprecedented but fully legal. Joint guardianship. Grant as the biological father with full legal rights. Hannah as the adoptive mother with shared guardianship. Maisie would live with Hannah, but Grant would have visitation and a say in every major decision about education and health, and Hannah would receive financial support not as charity, but as the father's responsibility to his child. Hannah listened, silent for a long time. Then she asked, "Why? You could take her. You have money, lawyers, everything. Why won't you take her?" Grant looked at her, then looked out the window where Maisie sat on the grass still dotted with melting snow, counting the steps the way she always did, and he said, "Because she calls you Mom, and that's not something I have the right to take away." Hannah didn't cry this time. She only nodded, slowly, and between two people who had walked through hell together, a new bond formed. Not love, not friendship, but respect, the kind of respect that exists only between people who have seen the weakest and the strongest parts of each other. 6 months later, Hannah moved into a small, tidy apartment in a quiet residential area on the north side of the city, an apartment she paid for herself with a job managing records at a nonprofit that supported women and children, a job Victor Ashworth had referred her to, but she earned on her own ability in the interview. Maisie started kindergarten at a school near their home, and every morning Hannah walked her to school, and Maisie counted the steps along the way. 1, 2, 3, 4, until she laughed because she'd miscounted, and that laughter rang down the quiet street like proof that sometimes life, after taking everything, gives back the most precious thing if you don't give up. Grant visited Maisie twice a week, and every time he came, Maisie ran to open the door with a smile that grew wider each week, calling him by a new name they had chosen together, Papa Grant, while she squeezed the old bear, Mochi, tightly to her chest. The nickname Eleanor had given to the toy had finally become the bridge that brought the father and daughter back together in the clear voice of the child he had lost and found. And the story of Hannah, of Grant, of Maisie stops here. Not because it ends, but because the most beautiful part of a story is sometimes the part the storyteller doesn't have to tell, the part the listener can feel and draw inside their own mind. Spring mornings when the snow melts, small dinners in a warm apartment, a mother who no longer has to go hungry so her child can eat, a father learning how to love again from the beginning, and a 5-year-old girl who now laughs often, who counts steps often, and who no longer grips her mother's coat sleeve when she's afraid, because she's learned that even if she lets go, her mother will still be there, and now there is one more person who will always be there too. This story may be fictional, but it carries something very real about the life we live every day. Sometimes the people who seem the weakest are the strongest when they fight for the ones they love. Justice can arrive late, but it is never absent if someone is brave enough to stand up and speak the truth. Power and money are never bigger than a mother's love for her child, and family is not always the people who share your blood, but sometimes the people who choose to stay, choose to protect, choose to respect each other through every storm. If this story touched your heart, if you saw a part of Hannah in yourself or in the strong women around you, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share this video so more people can listen, because every share you make gives us the drive to keep bringing meaningful stories every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Which part moved you most? Whether you've ever had a moment in your own life when love helped you survive something that felt impossible. Share it with us in the comments below, because we read every line and we listen to every feeling from the depths of your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peaceful, safe days beside the people you love. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.